This is a very delicate situation. Guys, welcome back to World War III. I was kind of having a conversation with myself late last night for about 5 hours, and the idea, and I've thought about this before, of the United States based on where we are currently at in the world, the idea behind distancing ourselves from NATO. Now, I've got an article from the AP News about Biden and NATO and their plan, and we're going to get into that. Their plan with Ukraine, Russia, what's going on there, what's going on, what happens if Putin uses the chemical warfare, how does NATO respond? I'm going to talk about that. But this has been something I've really been thinking about since about 2017, 2018. When you look at when NATO was created, when the United States, joined NATO right at the beginning of it in 1949, the United States was in a completely different place in the world. And there are about 5,000 different components to staying in this agreement, leaving this agreement. Where do we go? Does it create less peacefulness? I am going to talk about why I think it would be potentially a good idea for the United States to leave NATO or have a very loose agreement with NATO, preferably based on where the U.S. currently is at in the world with our GDP, with our military power. I would suggest making single alliances with all of the major powers in Western Europe, like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, things like that. The problem that I have with NATO and really seeing Russia and seeing how much they're struggling in Ukraine, it's giving me more and more confidence that the European Union would be able to defend itself against Russia. The whole idea currently when it comes to NATO is it's preventing Russia from pushing west. I don't think that's what's preventing Russia from pushing west. I think Russia's military is a lot weaker than we thought it was, and their military innovation is severely lacking since the fall of the Soviet Union. They're struggling mightily right now in Ukraine. I'm not saying they can't take Ukraine, but it's going to be an absolute mess. And judging by how much they're struggling, I would suggest the United States potentially distance itself. I mean, some of these countries, the problem that I have when it comes to NATO, my main issue with NATO is the idea of the United States kind of having the burden, because we are so much more powerful than every other country in the agreement. Now, that's nothing against all those other countries. The United States military budget is ridiculous. The only country that could come close would be China. That's nothing against it. But I'm just saying, when you have an agreement where one country has such a higher is so much more powerful than all of the other countries combined, the one country that has all the power, the burden ends up falling on them. You talk about the United States sending $13.6 billion in military aid to Ukraine. I don't see any other NATO country doing that. I really don't. And then they say, well, that's because the United States has a lot more money. So why are we in NATO? Why, really? That goes back to the question. We're so much more powerful than every other NATO country. Why don't we just do what China does, where we're kind of just an overseer and we stay neutral and everything? Personally, I would get out of NATO. I would create single military agreements with the Western powers of Europe to where we're not, beholden to potentially, say something happens in Albania or, Croatia or Czechoslovakia or Hungary, these places that are in NATO. People don't realize how many of these countries are in NATO. Albania, Belgium, Lithuania, Luxembourg, all of these ridiculously small countries. If they have a military escalation, the United States, the burden immediately falls onto the United States because the United States is the most powerful member of this group, and the burden would fall on us when this is a conflict that's happening in Europe. This is a conflict that's happening in Europe. So I'm seeing right now the Russian military struggle, and Biden goes to the NATO summit, and if I was Biden, it's a very delicate situation. It's something you want to tread lightly on, but I would tell the European powers, I would be like, listen, we did not anticipate China's military buildup happening this fast. We've got some intelligence that suggests China is an absolute huge threat, and I'm going to be honest with you, if something happens in Europe, thoughts and prayers, because we cannot, I don't want to say waste, it sounds bad, but we cannot waste assets, military assets in Russia as China just continues to get bigger and bigger, and they're a well-oiled machine and they're expanding exponentially. So if I was Biden, I would be like, listen, we can stay in NATO, we can loosely be associated with it, but preferably, you know, if something happens in Luxembourg, don't expect our help. We can send you some money, but it's like we're not sending troops into Europe. And again, guys, NATO was created right after Nazi Germany happened. They don't want another Nazi situation. This is a little bit different with Russia, but it is interesting to see how badly Russia is struggling, and this idea where maybe there's a window for the United States to kind of be an overseer. I love the role that China and the Chinese currently have over the world. They're pretty much neutral with most countries. And again, you take a look at the situation in Russia. China isn't like the West. They're not going to come out and be like, oh, we're way better than these people. They should not be invading. They're going to say, you know what? We're neutral on it. And the only way China has military agreements is if it benefits them. So why would China join a military agreement with Russia right now if they're not ready for war? China will join a military agreement with Russia when they're ready to go to war. Only when they're ready to go to war, not during peacetime. Now you could say, well, you know, NATO is meant to promote peace. That's why it was created. You're not going to have a country like Russia invading a smaller country. I understand that, but in general, do we really have to be this involved with Europe if Russia is the main enemy? There's no, you know, with Germany right now, there's no Nazi situation. You know, there's no crazy buildup with the UK, and it seems like we're eons away from another situation happening like that in Europe. It's really just the Russia problem, and Russia's military is struggling mightily in Ukraine, of all places. So, you know, I just don't want the United States to waste assets in Europe as China continues to exponentially grow their military. I guess that's what I'm saying. It's very complicated. I understand NATO promotes peace. It's meant so. You've got a country like Luxembourg, very small country. You know, if they get invaded, that would mean the United States would be going to war with Russia, so that would promote Russia to maybe not invade Luxembourg. Guys, I get it. I understand it's meant for peace. I'm not saying let's abandon it. I'm not saying let's abandon all of our power in Europe. I'm saying this is a delicate situation. If I'm Biden, you need to approach these leaders and be like, listen, we've got some intelligence in China, and this country is crazy. They're expanding. Their infrastructure is unbelievable. Their military buildup. They're already spending, $200 billion on the military, and that's only the reported numbers. The Chinese don't report a lot of their numbers. It's actually a lot more than that, and it's smart that China doesn't report the numbers. The United States shouldn't either, but they do because it's a free society. But when it comes to just this situation, it's so complicated. I've got an article of Biden at the NATO summit and the idea that Russia can use chemical warfare. How does NATO respond? Will NATO, we understand NATO is going to get involved if there's nukes, but will NATO get involved if there is chemical warfare? We've got an AP article that I wanted to go over. It says Biden pledges new Ukraine aid, warns Russia on chemical weapons. I mean, haven't we said, listen, I don't want to say, we've sent a lot of money to Ukraine. How about this is the problem with NATO. The burden falls on the country that's by far the most powerful, and we're not even a country that's located in Europe. Again, I'm not trying to sound, I'm saying from an American standpoint, we want America to succeed. NATO is just, we're so much more powerful than every other country that's in the agreement. The burden falls on the United States. I don't see another NATO country sending $13.6 billion in military aid to Ukraine. And then people still say that we should do more. People say, oh, you need to put a no-fly zone up. Yeah, that's real smart. That's people that really don't know anything about the situation. But still, it's just, you're saying the United States needs to do more. How about the countries in Europe that are actually, more affected? How about they do more? How about the NATO countries do more? But Biden already running his mouth at NATO, talking about the United States sending even more aid. Which, listen, I'm happy to supply them, but how about some of the other countries step up and give some military aid to the Ukraine citizens? And then they're like, oh, they do. I haven't seen any numbers close to 13.6 billion. Are we seeing like even 10 billion from Germany? No, because their GDP is so much lower. Then why are we in the agreement anyways? Because if we're just going to have so much more of the burden, why are we in the agreement? Why can't we be like the Chinese, where we're just overseers and we only join military agreements right before war when it benefits us? Again, I want it to be peaceful. The only way we're going to have world peace, you guys want to know world peace? The United States and China have a military agreement. There's your world peace. Is that happening? No. China would never agree to that. China would never agree to that. And really, I can't blame them. I cannot blame them. They want to be better than the United States. They really do. And I would be hypocritical if I said, oh, they're greedy. They should do this for world peace. You guys want world peace? NATO is not going to create world peace. China and America having a military agreement is the only thing that would create world peace, because they would overpower everyone, and everyone would be scared to death to do any military action if China and the United States had an agreement. But the Chinese will never do that. The Chinese would never do that. The only way China would do that would be to brainwash America even more and then just backstab America in the event when they're actually ready to go to war. But China would never do that, and America would never do that. But let's get to this article where Biden talks about Ukraine. Biden, in an early evening news conference after the meetings, warned that a chemical attack by Russia would trigger a response in kind. You're asking whether NATO would cross. We'd make that decision at the time. So that's the idea, that NATO troops going in to help Ukraine if a chemical warfare situation were to unfold. However, a White House official said that they did not imply any shift in the U.S. position against direct military action in Ukraine. Biden and NATO allies have stressed that the U.S. and NATO would not put troops on the ground in Ukraine. So just judging from that little paragraph, it sounds like even if a chemical warfare situation happened, NATO would probably not budge. It sounds like to me, and this might be in part why Putin did this, no matter what happens, unless they're using nukes, NATO is not going to risk it. NATO is not going to go to World War III for Ukraine. They're just not interested in that, even if chemical warfare comes out. That's what this article is telling me. 1% of all your planes, 1% of all your tanks. Zelensky asked members of the NATO alliance. That'll never happen. We can't just buy those. When we have all of this, it will give us, just like you, 100% security. So Zelensky pressuring the West for more military support. You can't blame him, but we're not giving 1% of our military aid to them. Not even close. NATO's not doing that either. Biden said more aid was on the way, but the Western leaders were treading carefully so as not to further escalate the conflict beyond the borders of Ukraine. Quote, NATO has made a choice to support Ukraine in the war without going to war with Russia. Therefore, we have decided to intensify our ongoing work to prevent any escalation and to get organized in case there is an escalation. So NATO at this summit, they're all meeting with, United States, France, and they're all talking. Their stance is very similar to what it's always been. They're not going to World War III over Ukraine. They're going to help Ukraine. They're going to send a lot of military aid, which is amazing for Ukraine. People underestimate how important that is. If you're not like, oh, you're not sending troops. Military aid is what's helping Ukraine significantly here, guys. NATO is helping Ukraine. Billions of dollars of military hardware have already been provided to Ukraine. A U.S. official who requested anonymity to discuss internal deliberations said Western nations were discussing the possibility of providing anti-ship weapons amid concerns that Russia will launch amphibious assaults along the Black Sea coast. Biden said his top priority at Thursday's meetings was to make certain that the West stayed on the same page in response to Russian aggression against Ukraine, with Russia facing increased international isolation. NATO Security General also warned China against coming to Moscow's rescue. He called on Beijing to join the rest of the world and clearly condemn the brutal war against Ukraine and not support Russia. China has these people so frazzled, man. I mean, really? Oh my gosh. So guys, that article, they're doing the same thing. It sounds like even if chemical warfare comes out, there wouldn't be a response in terms of troops on the ground in NATO. NATO, once again, making it clear, and I agree with this, we're not going to World War III over Ukraine. I think Putin knew that. That's one of the only intelligence things that Putin and the Russian Federation got right, is that NATO is not willing to go to World War III over Ukraine, although I don't think they thought, well, they certainly didn't thought that the West would send this much military support to NATO. The United States $13 billion military package that came 2 weeks ago. Biden's already talking again about sending another one. So interesting stuff there. But guys, there's just so much to look at when it comes to the overall power structure right now of the world, of NATO. I understand it's a peace thing. I get it, guys. It's nothing against NATO. I'm saying the United States this has been something I've thought about for 3 or 4 years, and obviously bringing it up right now is not the perfect time considering Russia is aggressive right now into Europe. But I also see Russia struggling significantly in Europe. Listen, if Russia went in and they took Kyiv in 2 days, okay, we can stay in NATO. But I'm seeing a Russian military that seems to be overrated on the national stage. You've got a lot of people that are scared of Russia when the reality of the situation is they aren't nearly as powerful as many people think, and it's really the United States and China. And I would like to see America transition to more of a kind of just leadership role rather than being a NATO member where you make these single alliances with the Western European countries. And then I would mainly shift my focus to the Pacific states, shoring up a massive military agreement with South Korea and Japan in the event that China gets really aggressive. I don't think China's right now dumb enough to do that. They're still building, they're still growing, but it's just like I'm visualizing, I'm seeing everything, and I'm seeing America really just get the short end of the stick when it comes to all of this stuff. It's like, we're sending so much more money than you. And then they're like, oh, because you have a higher, GDP. Well, then why are we in the agreement in the first place? If we have, like, the United States has such a bigger military than every country in NATO combined, like, this is a military alliance that does very little good for us. Very little good at this point. And, like, our goal is to prevent Russia escalation. Russia can't even take over Ukraine. Russia can't even take over Ukraine. So like, what is the goal of this alliance exactly? I don't know. It's like, shouldn't the burden of military aid fall on the European countries rather than fall, again, I know they're sending stuff, but I'm just saying, shouldn't most of the money come from the European countries? They're landlocked with Russia. We're not, okay? And if I'm Biden and I'm at this NATO summit, I'm saying, listen, we have a major national security crisis with China. You guys are on your own. I'm sorry, but you guys are on your own against Russia. I have faith in the European Union. Good luck. We're arming up against China. That's what I would say. Honestly, that's what I would say. And you know what? We can loosely be involved, but we're more of an overseer now. We're not going to send you $50 billion in military aid. You guys got to protect Ukraine. You guys got to protect Ukraine. We need to arm ourselves. We need to keep that money to prepare ourselves. And it's so interesting when you look at the military strategy and Russia just simply unorganized. I think one of the main problems Russia has had with their military, there's just so much problems when it comes to organizing on the border and actually achieving objectives in these Ukraine cities to take them over. The United States needs to spend more money on military infrastructure. You need to do more tests with these soldiers, have them prepared. You can spend as much money on the equipment as humanly possible, but if you don't have the soldiers, if they're just robots, if they can't critically think, if they don't know what to do in crisis, that military equipment does little good for you. So the United States needs to spend more money, make sure the troops are organized, spend more money on organization, because I think Russia has had a major problem with their troops and their military leaders when it comes to organization on how you take over these cities. We hear reports about just one Ukraine citizen like bombing tanks and stuff, and it's just like you need to clear the cities out and then bring the tanks in, but they're just so unorganized right now. The United States really needs to focus on that. Learn from other countries' mistakes. Learn from what Russia is doing wrong. Have some intelligence on the ground, not just because we want to see what Russia is doing and how it's advancing, but we want to see what they do wrong in a war scenario. This is really the first time we've gotten an example of a country invading another country in the 21st century. Let's examine it, let's investigate it, and just dissect it from a level of, where did they have success? Where did they fail? What do we need to do? Should we steal any type of military strategy from the Russians? Why didn't this work? Why did that work? Why are their citizens against them? All of that we need to look into. And I think this war right now, it's just a unique thing where it's like, wait a minute, we're in NATO because of Russian escalation. And I know there's like, oh, another Nazi Germany comes along. Guys, we are so far away from another Nazi Germany. You know how hard it would be for a Nazi Germany to happen this day and age with the nukes that the United States have and China has? You know how hard that would be for like a Germany to take over all of Europe? Like, that's not even close to advisable. This pact is outdated. This treaty is outdated. It was created in 1949 in a completely different world. And I don't have anything against NATO. I just want what's best for the United States. And I think China is in a very envious position where we should be, where they're just overseers and they're not going to make any rash judgments and be like, oh, we're holier than thou. We hate Russia now. It's like they're just such a more calm government. They don't make rash decisions. They're like, listen, we're neutral. Okay, we're neutral on this. And again, it's just there's a lot of jealousy with it. I'm jealous of the Chinese government. I honestly am, because what they're able to do and the control they're able to have over that massive population with their citizens due to the communist government is really amazing. It's something that should be studied. But guys, when it comes to NATO, Biden meets with NATO. NATO says, listen, if I was a Ukraine citizen, I would be pissed. Because the stuff that I just read, at least, maybe they had other stuff that was different, but it basically insinuated, I think, if there was chemical warfare, there's certainly no guarantee that NATO would step in. It's not even close. Maybe like a 20% chance at most, depending on the scale of the chemical warfare. So, this is something that if the United States were to leave NATO, you have to be on tippy toes, delicate. The European countries would get pissed about it, but the European Union, as long as it stays together, we really don't have an issue, because I would trust the European Union in a war against Russia, especially the way Russia is struggling against Ukraine. You don't want to, draw too many conclusions on the Russian military, but this is crazy. I mean, they cannot move in Ukraine, and it's just like they're so unorganized. I think people overestimated how good the Russian military is. I certainly did. It's tough to know these things considering we've never had an invasion. I've never been alive really for an invasion. You can talk about the United States situation in the West, in Afghanistan. That's completely different. This is a landlocked country invading another country trying to take it over. We've never seen something like that. And it is just a struggle for the Russian people. So guys, just another quick thing I saw. Ukraine says Moscow is forcibly taking... Just another quick thing I saw from the AP that was really interesting. Ukraine says Moscow is forcibly taking citizens to Russia. Ukraine accused Moscow on Thursday of forcibly taking hundreds of thousands of citizens from shattered Ukrainian cities to Russia, where some may be used as hostages to pressure Kyiv to give up. If they're doing that, that reeks of desperation. That reeks of desperation from the Russian military, if they're seriously doing that. So that's a report that's coming from Ukraine, that the Russian military has now been ordered, after the cities have pretty much been evacuated, you've bombed them to shit, go invade, get up as many citizens as you can, take them to Russia, use them as hostages, as negotiation leverage over the Ukraine government to potentially take the capital of Ukraine using hostages. Russia, I'm sure, never thought they were going to have to be in this position, but that tells me that Russia, things are not going well. If they're forced to do things like that, I'm sure they never thought they were going to do that, but that tells me that they are struggling and facing a lot more resistance than they had originally planned. But guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.